Now, we will do a deep dive into Vue application. There is a lot of code that comes with this simple project, so let's explore what we have inside. Let's start from the main.js file. As the name suggests, this is the main file of a Vue application. The first thing that we do here is we import createApp function. The job of this function is to create a new application instance. The parameter that we are passing to this createApp function is our root component. By default, this is app.vue that we will examine in just a moment. Most of the methods available on the application instance will return that instance, which allows us to chain methods on it like we are doing right here, except the mount method that actually returns the root component instance and not the application instance. .use method allows us to register plugins into our application. These plugins usually add some global level functionality to the application, for example router and store, which we have here and we will cover later on. And lastly, with the mounted method, we are specifying into which DOM element to mount the Vue application. In this case, and by default, it is a div with ID of app. So if we go into our public folder here, we have this index.html file. And here we have this div with an ID of app. This is where our Vue application will be mounted. Let's examine what we have inside app.vue component. So components are one of the most important features in Vue. With components, we will create our custom elements, which combined will give us the UI of our application. Every Vue component can have three things: template, script, and style. In this case, we only have template and style, but we will add script later on to demonstrate. Vue uses an HTML-based template syntax that allows us to bind the rendered DOM to the Vue instance data, and we will take a closer look at what that means soon. Behind the scene, Vue compiles templates into virtual DOM render functions, and then with an algorithm determines the minimal number of components to re-render and the minimal number of DOM manipulations to perform when our application state changes, in order to prevent performance loss. So let's also skip this router for now, because this is a bit more advanced topic that we will cover later on. And let's move to style. So in this style part here, we actually write and apply styles to our component. Let's create our script tags here. And we have to return an object inside here. So inside script, well, we will have some local state for our component, and we will also have, let's say, some functions that will perform various operations on our state. And by the way, you can download this plugin, vTour here, that will allow this Vue tooling where you can create some scaffold, for example, this script tag here, just by typing a couple of words. So make sure to check it out. So then here, in order to have some local state, we can define this data method, which has to return an object. And inside this object, well, we can define some properties that will actually be our local state. For example, let's have a name here. So the most important part to understand and to remember about this data, it has to be a method, it has to be a function that returns an object. It can't be an object by itself. Because if you have multiple component instances of the same component, and that is the core principle of components, they are there to be shared across your Vue application. So if you change this name property in one component, then it would override this name property in all other components. But by encapsulating this inside a method, you ensure that every component has its own independent state that other components cannot override. And that is why you have to really have this principle in mind. So let's also comment out all of this code here. And let's define a new div here. And we can display what we have here by using this mustache syntax and just specifying the name of our variable here, or our local state property. So if we save and we go back to our component here, well, we don't have anything. So let's add some name here, for example, my name, and it's displayed right here. Let me show you something that I've already mentioned, and that is that Vue, with some magic, allows you to bind DOM with our data part here. And let's actually test how this works. So I'll have a input here. So the goal is when I change this input, I want to change this name property here. And for that, we can use a directive, which is built inside Vue, and it is called vModel. And we have to specify to which property this will bind. So vModel allows us to have a two-way binding between our DOM here and our property here. So now if any of these two changes, well, it would reflect on both. So they always have the same data inside. So if I go here, we have our state written here from this here part, and we have our input. And you already see that this input is filled with this name here. So if I change this, so for example, if I delete a couple of letters, it reflects the change. Or if I add something, for example, this text here, well, it reflects the changes. While we are here, let's also explore how we can create some functions to manipulate our local state. So inside our component, I want to have another property here, counter, which will be 0 initially. And here I want to make some line that will separate these two parts. And let's display this counter here. And also want to have a button. So when we click on this button, so let's add to increment. I want to increment this counter state by 1. So Vue allows you to register event listeners on elements that will listen for some events happening on these elements. And we can use this add syntax, and then here say click, and then here specify what will happen. So for example, counter, and we want to increment by 1. So just counter ++. So let's save and let's see what happens. So when we click, well, our state increments, it changes. And this approach is fine, having this inline style if you have some small operation happening. For example, here we are just incrementing our state by 1. But for example, if you have some more complex operations happening, then it's better to create custom methods that will handle your logic. So here let's define methods property, which is actually an object, and then let's say increment counter, which is a function. And to access this counter, we have to use this. So this.counter++. And then instead of incrementing here, let's call our method increment counter. Let's save and let's check what happens. So if I click, well, the same behavior happens, only now we are using this custom method.